I don't really like birds that much. I worked at a pet store for a while, and I know a handful of people that own or have owned birds in the past. They're loud, smelly, and they prefer to kick and peck seeds anywhere that isn't their cage. They're a pet for specific types of people, myself not included. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate birds. I just had no desire to have one as a pet, which is why I was concerned for my mental well-being when I somehow became the host house and parental figure for several species of bird in my backyard. I don't have a massive or interesting space outside. There's one tree, a small garden, a shed, and a small deck with some patio furniture, all surrounded by a high fence. It's enough to sit out and relax without worrying about prying neighbours, but not much else. Since I retired, I began storing some of my personal hobbies in the shed, along with a few gardening tools, so I could spend more time outside. The birds didn't all appear at once, but I made the mistake of being too nice to one too many of them, and suddenly my yard became some sort of aviary. I put out a small bird feeder for the little brown ones I saw hopping around on my tree. They're the ones you see in droves, shuffling out from underneath your car or nesting in the giant letters of your favourite big store box. The robins were the next frequent visitors, plucking worms out of the garden and making the bird feeder swing as they came barreling in to swipe some of the seeds for themselves. The blue jays were a bit of a rare sight in the beginning, but the shock of their bright plumage began to appear more often along the fence as the days went on. I didn't have a bird bath or anything, just that one feeder. Apparently, that was enough for word to travel through the bird grapevine, and my house became the hottest spot for birds in the whole town. In the span of 2 weeks, I went from a few birds going in and out of the bird feeder at a time, to tens of birds hanging out my tree and on my fence, taking turns pecking at my one lonely bird feeder all day long. I accepted my fate the first time that bird feeder ran out in a single day. I looked at the situation logically. These weren't my pets. They were wild animals. They wouldn't be living in my house, so I wouldn't have to deal with the smell trapped inside. They could take care of themselves if they were desperate, free to roam and never return to my house if they chose to. They also polished off every seed that fell out of the bird feeder. I lived on the side of a busy road where the houses were spread a bit further apart to keep the speed limit from dropping below 60 kilometers per hour, so I wasn't really worried about the neighbors becoming too interested in my new hobby. If the poop got too bad, I could just hose down the backyard in a few quick sweeps while watering the garden. I didn't see any real downsides to it, so I went out the next day, bought another bird feeder to hang up in the tree, a hummingbird feeder for the deck, and a bird bath for the garden. If I was committing to a bird sanctuary, I was going all out. I was living alone at the time, and I oddly enjoyed having so many colourful birds to look at in the backyard. I'd miss it if they stopped coming here. The crows came a few days later, and it was a strange spectacle. I suppose in the urban jungle, crows were something of royalty. The other birds would squawk and shuffle out of their way as they hopped from branch to branch, their obsidian bodies massive in comparison to many of the other birds. I think for a period of time they scared away several of the others, but eventually they found their own balance amongst each other, and everyone settled back in. I grew more accustomed to the presence of so many birds, and eventually I started talking to them. Begrudgingly, mind you, like they were my misbehaving children, especially the crows. They were almost a school bully, or a sibling always looking for a fight. "Wait your turn. Go sit with the others on the tree. Don't be a brat. Go sit on the fence. You're too big for that branch. You'll snap it and scare the little ones. Don't bother the hummingbirds. They haven't done anything to you." Now, just as I was getting more comfortable with the birds, they were getting increasingly more comfortable with me. At first, they would fly away and watch me from the tree as I filled the feeder, but eventually, they just fluttered to the end of the deck, some of them brave enough to creep up closer and chirp at me. Yeah, it has to get filled at some point. You can wait 30 seconds to keep eating," I muttered, turning and raising an eyebrow and the handful of little brown birds that all looked up at me with wide eyes. I had to admit, it was pretty cute. A crow cawed loudly at me from the edge of the fence nearby, interrupting my moment. "You can quiet down over there. Let them go first," I scolded with narrow eyes. "Here," I grumbled, grabbing a handful of seed from my bag and backing away from the feeder, the smaller birds instantly pouncing on the contraption. The crow regarded me carefully as I walked to a different section of the deck, crouching down to put a pile of seeds on the planks of wood. I could hear the beating of their wings as 3 crows immediately landed a few feet away from where I was kneeling. "Hey, hold on a sec." I glared up at them. All 3 shockingly obeyed, freezing in their approach. I looked at them individually, an amused smile creeping over my face. "All right, have at it," I laughed, standing up, the seeds at my feet. They didn't even bother waiting for me to move away, hopping over and pecking at the pile once I'd given the go-ahead. The birds continued to surprise me in the following weeks, especially the crows. I knew that they were smart birds, but it threw me for a loop sometimes at how well they seemed to pick up exactly what I was saying. My nagging seemed to hold more weight now, and they watched me more closely. They eventually didn't come over to me unless there was food involved, but it was an interesting development, and honestly, a better system. They left the little ones alone most of the time now, and waited patiently for me to hand feed them instead. I knew this could potentially be a bad thing, getting too attached to the wildlife getting too attached to me. I knew. I just did it anyway. The crows were funny. I started feeding them bits of my own food as well, since I knew crows were scavengers and would probably eat anything, not just seeds. One day, I hadn't even put my scraps down, and I felt a weight drop suddenly onto my head. The wing flaps gave away what it was, but it startled a laugh out of me. "So impatient," I muttered, but my lips were spread in a smile. They grew more comfortable with me, and even went as far as to come investigate and hang out with me, even when I didn't have any food. That was a big step. I had 5 crows that frequented my yard, and they would all park themselves at various points around me as I read a book or browsed my phone or laptop. I often puttered about in the shed too, but I kept them out of it. They didn't like being barred from the shed, but it was basically the same rule as the house. They'd always squawk at me as if I was taking too long, all of them perched on the roof, waiting for me to come out. The next step was touching, and it was mostly accidental at first. I'd shifted my position or stand up after an hour or 2 of sitting on the patio chair and startle them into moving. Eventually, I had to gently nudge some of them out of the way in order to get up, one of them deciding that my lap was a good place to settle if my laptop wasn't there, or my shoulder if it was. I didn't ramble on or tell them extensive stories, but they followed my command and came when I called. I didn't need to name them, but I knew the 5 of them apart. They were always watching me when I was in the yard, and all I had to do was look at whoever I was talking to, and they understood. One day, I was pleasantly surprised when one of them brought me a gift. It wasn't anything special. It was literally just a stick. But I laughed, and I took it with a "Thanks for the present, buddy," and a little 2-fingered pat on his feathered head. Not all of them took up the gift giving, thank God. Having 2 of them battling it out was enough. They would each bring me something at the end of the day that they'd found around town. I had a bucket that I kept outside. I'd take their little rock or their piece of plastic, and I'd give them a little scratch and a thank you before I'd put it in. There were small enough items that I didn't fill up the bucket very fast. A piece of a plastic spoon, a doll's shoe, a shiny candy wrapper, the list goes on. They picked up early on that I didn't really like the food, because I would take it in the house and put it in the small compost bin and not into the bucket like the others. Another day, I got a shiny ring and felt a bit guilty about it. There weren't any markings, and I didn't have the time or energy to do anything about it, but I couldn't have them stealing valuable things and bringing too much attention to me. I took it inside, and they got the same message with the food. No precious metals. They picked up on a lot of things. The smart birds. One day, I was sitting around with my feet up, laptop on my lap, a crow on my shoulder, 2 crows on the table beside me, and a crow on one of the armrests I wasn't using. The one on my shoulder had already given his gift for the day and was rather pleased with himself. "Wonder where the other one is, hey?" I asked out loud, to none of them in particular, distracted by my laptop. 10 minutes later, I heard the beat of wings, but didn't bother looking up as I finished typing my paragraph. I felt pressure on my other shoulder, and then something tumbled abruptly down in front of my shirt and landed on my lap. My hands froze on the keyboard as my eyes flickered to my newest gift. An eyeball stared up at me, blood trailing messily down the front of my shirt and onto my pants. It was partially deflated, a pus-like goop mixing in with the blood where it had landed and oozed out. It must have been punctured by the crow's beak as he carried it. I stared at the eyeball blankly for another moment, trying to process what to do. A dead animal was one thing, but this was clearly a human eyeball. My heart hammered in my chest as the crow shifted its feet around on my shoulder, clearly waiting for his praise. I carefully lifted myself out of the chair, grabbing the gooey mess in one of my hands. The birds hopped off my shoulder, their heads twisting to watch what I would do with the organ that had been so gracefully plopped onto my lap. I glanced over to the shed, staring at the crack in the door. I must have left it unlocked accidentally this morning, and I hadn't shut it all the way. I thought carefully where I might have stashed what I was looking for before shuffling away inside the house. The crow let out a squawk, disappointed at my current trajectory. "1 second, buddy," I said with a grimace, as I tried to think where in the house I'd left it. I walked quickly in and down to the basement, trying not to let the slimy mess in my hand drip onto the floor. It only took me a few minutes to find it, and I let out a relieved breath. "All of you, come here," I called carefully as I emerged back out onto the yard. The crows shifted uneasily, flapping their wings in confusion as I walked over to the shed. They hesitated, wary, but eventually flew over to the grass where I stood in front of it. I had the eye in one hand and a new, shiny bucket in the other. I set the bucket down and opened the shed doors wide so they could all take a good look inside. It was clear that the one who'd brought me the gift had snuck in and taken a peek anyway, and brought me something he thought I'd like. Hundreds of eyes stared out from inside the shed, pristine and perfect in their jars, lining every shelf I'd built to hold them. The new bucket was identical to the one I kept beside my chair on the desk. I was lucky I had a spare. I knelt and put it inside the shed, letting the eyeball slide off my hand and thunk down into it. That one wasn't usable, but perhaps I would receive one in better condition in the future, if I played my cards right. These go in an extra special bucket, okay? Good job. I grinned, and the crow hopped excitedly up to me for some well-deserved head scratches. Some of the others cawed and peered around me inside the shed with their heads cocked in curiosity. I really do love my murder of crows.